To assemble the myriad puzzled pieces that make up the UAP subject, all the fractured edges and fraught glimpses, then gaze for a brief bit on the picture at root in those shards, this is Neon Galactic. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. As we've all repeatedly seen, this subject attracts the brightest and most creative minds, from scientists and scholars willing to buck a broken system to intrepid reporters angling to capture the biggest scoop possible in all of human history. Some are better prepared than others. Our guest tonight, as proven by his latest book, The Light Beyond the Mountains, seems the perfect man for this profound moment. Nick Cook, career reporter in the arms industry, has, over the past year and some, been quietly publishing in serialized form a biographical, technological, and metaphysical examination of the UAP/NHI subject, correlating streams of evidence with his own deep research to present a picture of what's actually at play. In the end, there's hardly a corner of this strange subject that remains untouched by Cook's reporting. He doesn't shy away from the difficult terrain of consciousness, nor mythology, technology, cosmology, neuroscience, World War II history, plasma physics, nuclear testing, mysticism, and more. Here's the clincher, we actually get somewhere. During this his urgent exploration of UAP thought and history, a few themes ring out to help Cook and the reader ascertain through the mystery a plausible picture taking shape. Synthesizing the work of Donald Hoffman, Ingo Swann, Philip K. Dick, Robert Bigelow, Edgar Mitchell, Jacques Vallee, Kit Green, Garry Nolan, Teoradani, and many others, we find a phenomenon emerging that for once tickles the bounds of sense, slowly resolving into a kind of tentative coherence to draw us further forward. What he reveals is almost fantastical, yet remains rooted in science, phenomenology, mythology, and consciousness. His conclusions hint at a scientific basis for the control theory ruminations of Jacques Vallee and underline the provocative terms so famously captured on ATIP's cryptic slide 9, like psychotronics. Breathlessly, we're left on the threshold of an emerging Thomas Kuhnian kind of shift in operative worldview. And like the Ouroboros of old, we're forced to finally ask ourselves, did the Gnostics have it right all along? Welcome to the show, Nick.
Well, thank you, James. That was breathless and very encapsulating introduction. You kind of seem to capture most of it, which means that I should congratulate you. That was an extraordinary intro. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Like I had mentioned before we started, I loved your book. I think it's probably one of the more complete, a complete synthesis of all of the threads that go into this topic. And there are so many from, like I mentioned, mythology and science and all of these different things. And you do a fantastic job of weaving them together while, doing so while charting your own kind of biographical journey through the subject matter. So it gives a narrative arc as your own growth is achieved, but then kind of breaks open the subject to reveal some deeper patterns that may, I think, prove to be, formative to, or at least indicative of what's actually happening. And there's so few times that I can read a book and walk away thinking, that may actually be what we're talking about here. So you're to be congratulated on the book and your research and everything that you've done in your career to get to this point, I think. Let's start with, for the interview, for the conversation. I called you the perfect man for the perfect moment. And the reason is because you have a career that straddles both sides of this subject, from being both a hardcore reporter talking about material things and technologies that's right on the cutting edge, and government and financing and all that stuff. And then you've also been a researcher, a successful researcher into consciousness, working with Bigelow and winning prize-winning essays, and really diving into the subject of perception and who and what we are. So those two things coalesce to make this book as powerful as it is. Can you talk a little bit about how you got to this place of being equipped so readily for writing The Light Beyond the Mountains?
Well, I think, as I say at some point in the book, that retro causality is a very funny thing because, of course, it's only when you look back on your career and your life and various pivots that have occurred within it that you sort of realize that it makes a kind of sense because as I was as I was going through all of this, my journey to where I am now, I'm thinking at the time this is all pretty disjointed and um, segmented, and it really, as a career, it doesn't seem to make much sense. But then, as you were generous, more than generous enough to say in your introduction, James, you sort of suddenly realize at the time we're all at, where there is a great deal of uncertainty about the reality that we're in. And a lot of it, seems strange and it feels strange. I talk to a lot of people, about how they sense this moment in time and where we are in the world. And a lot of people talk about anxiety and a sort of uncertainty about the future. Um, I hate leaving threads untied, um, and I feel that the gifts that I've been given, in the sense that I kind of fell into an aerospace and defense reporting career by accident. Um, in some respects, I fell into the consciousness field by accident as well, or at least I was sort of propelled into it. But those two things have merged and combined, I feel, to give me a kind of window on what's happening at the moment. And I feel very privileged to be able to do that with the skill sets that I've amassed in my career and in my life. And so to your point, I've sort of ended up at this point, this moment in my life and career, feeling excited in many respects by what I'm seeing and sensing out there in the phenomenon and where we are. A little unnerved by it too, because I think that, we are at, as many commentators have said, at a pretty dangerous inflection point, in terms of where we are in the world at the moment. But I'm hopeful, and that's one of the reasons I called the book, which is serialized, as you know, on Substack, The Light Beyond the Mountains, because I am by nature hopeful. I think that we are offered hope in this phenomenon, and I hope that maybe we'll unpack some of that as we go through the through this conversation.
Yeah. Now you mentioned it's serialized and it's done with you have installments of the book and it's coupled with all kinds of other content that you post, whether it's interviews or articles that sort of relate to the content in the book, and it makes for a fascinating subscription for folks who really want to dive into all these topics. My question to you, as someone who's kind of witnessed this from afar, was there how much of this did you have in your head before you started writing? How much of it sort of came to you through research and stuff as you were getting through it? And what was your mission setting out at the beginning?
Well, I wanted to write a book about consciousness first and foremost. And I think as I sort of relate in the introduction to the book, that that was not a straightforward path because a lot of people, people in publishing said to me, well, okay, you want to write a book on consciousness, that's great. But you're not qualified to write a book on consciousness. To which I would say, well, I don't really know anyone who is. I mean,
Right.
consciousness is it's what animates us. It is what makes us self-aware. It is what gives us our perception of reality. If you're taking a materialist stand, of course, it helps if you're a neuroscientist to unpack, brain science, and in that sense to unpack, the way we interface with reality. But I don't think that's the basis of the core of our sense of reality at all. Um, I think if we want to truly understand consciousness and reality, we have to take a non-materialist standpoint. And that makes just about anyone qualified to talk about consciousness. So I rejected that I rejected that critique of, why I shouldn't talk about consciousness in a book. But I accepted something else that was offered to me as some guidance, which was, well, it would help if you could talk about consciousness from the point of view of your expertise. And as you said in your introduction, I was trained as an aerospace and defense journalist, as an investigative reporter. And I worked for many years for a magazine that was probably in its day the sort of pinnacle of defense journalism. It was called Jane's Defense Weekly. It gave me access to just about anyone involved in the aerospace and defense sector on the planet at the time. And so I thought that using that as my portal of entry to the consciousness discussion would be a good thing. And of course, aerospace and defense, aerospace particularly, kind of intersects with the whole UFO and UAP story. So that was sort of my portal of entry was the UAP UFO phenomenon. But I used that as a method to access the consciousness story. And then a lot of people say, well, that's not altogether intuitive how UAP and UFOs interact with consciousness. But that, in a sense, was the point of the book. I wanted to show by unpacking the sort of the UAP story insofar as I could from the standpoint of someone who could filter out a lot of the sort of the aerospace side of the story. So I felt that by kind of pulling apart the UAP phenomenon insofar as I was able, I'd be able then also to sort of find a way into the consciousness story. And I think hopefully over the course of this conversation, we can unfold some of that too. So that was sort of my rationale for doing this. Did I have a preconceived story before I went into it? Well, there were certain waypoints that I knew that I wanted to cover.
Yeah.
The book starts, as you'll know, with a sighting by me on the periphery of Area 51 in 1992. What I saw was, it sounds a little bit like that bit in Close Encounters of the Third Kind when the guy at the very beginning, before, I think it might have been the pre-title sequence, or anyway, right at the beginning of the movie, this old Mexican guy relates how he had an encounter, and he said it was like the sun rising at night. It was like, and it didn't sing to me as happened in the movie, but it certainly, the sun rose above Area 51 in the night sky. And this was an orange object. It was dazzlingly bright. Classically, it would have been labeled a UFO, but I'm there with a mate of mine who currently writes for Aviation Week. His name is Guy Norris. We were both there. We both saw this thing. And between us, using our aerospace and defense expertise, we're sort of able to kind of pick it apart a bit and dismiss certain things and then go with certain things. So using this as the start point of the story, I then go a bit into the UFO phenomenon, and then I also then drift into the whole sort of consciousness aspect through my association with Ingo Swann, who I was fortunate enough to know, and as many people will know, Ingo was the sort of first and foremost remote viewer in the CIA's remote viewing program from its inception in 1972-73. So I'm again lucky enough in that I had a number of sort of methods of entry into this story, and I've just given you two of them, so we can go from there.
Yeah. Ingo Swann is such a huge part of where I've been become fascinated with the subject, remote viewing, but then also his book Penetration was so fascinating, which you go into a little bit with you relating the story of his encounters with the mysterious Axelrod and what he remote viewed on the moon. And there was some discussion in your book about, even he acknowledged that some of it's more believable than others, and I was kind of intrigued by what all that meant. But using Ingo Swann's perspective, and you go on through the book to relate these anecdotes with various key figures in the ufological movement. Yeah, Lavalley and all the people that you've dealt with over the course of your journalism career, and the whole book seems to be a process of winnowing your own view of what UAPs are and consciousness as it relates. But I mean, I can tell through the book and through our previous conversations that consciousness was your real quarry in the course of the book. Like this is a book about consciousness through the lens of UAP rather than a book about UAP that hints at, connections to consciousness. And of course, that's right in line with where I'm at. So maybe I'm predisposed to be a huge fan of your book. But starting with Ingo, can you talk a little bit about what he did and what he represents that provided such a key for you to be able to, decode the UAP subject and consciousness more broadly?
Yeah, so I'll get to that in just a second, but I just wanted to address another point that you made, which is sort of like this is almost like me, you know, um, moving from stepping stone to stepping stone through this story, and that, in a sense, actually was very deliberate, in that, I'm essentially my career has been built on um, mainstream publishing. I've been lucky enough to publish books in the mainstream arena, and to write for a non-specialized audience. I mean, admittedly, I started my career writing for a very specialized audience, which was the aerospace and defense community. But alongside that, I always wrote books. I wrote novels to begin with, and then I wrote nonfiction. I've ghostwritten for other people. So I've written a lot, and I've always wanted to write or aspired to write for a mainstream readership. So what I'm doing in this story is I'm literally confronting the phenomena of UAP, UFOs, and consciousness as any kind of journeyman explorer or researcher would, coming to the subjects, both of those subjects, cold. Um, I didn't really have much of an interest in UFOs and UAP. Um, Certainly, before a couple of decades ago, um, and so I'm able to confront that aspect of this story much as anyone coming to the subject cold would, and even more so when it comes to consciousness, which, as we all know, is arcane to say the least. I mean, I said earlier, no one knows what causes consciousness. Nobody does. There are theories about it, but no one knows how it is that we are able to perceive the world and ourselves in the way that we do. And I wanted to imbue and impart some of the wonder and mystery that I felt, and also the confusion and perplexion. I mean, I was perplexed by this thing as much as anyone else was. So I wanted to sort of unfold that story as these perplexing aspects of both phenomena were presented to me. And I hope that that makes for an interesting read. I mean, I have a kind of thriller background. I also, have written thrillers, and I wanted to sort of impart that sort of sense of this is a journey. There are lots of dead ends in it for me. There are lots of barriers to overcome as well, not least in my own understanding of what I'm being presented with. So I wanted to sort of convey those pivot moments in the story with they're not cliffhangers exactly, but they the irony is I'm writing this as a serialization, and I'm sure some of these same issues and problems were confronted by some of the great serializing writers of our, not just of our time, but of all time, like Charles Dickens, like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and who wrote Sherlock Holmes like this. They serialize their stories. It's not a very convenient medium to tell a story in. So I needed to, a bit like Saturday cinema, where, you were always left at the end of an episode with a cliffhanger. At the end of each chapter, I needed to leave a bit of a cliffhanger. So all in all, what I've done is I've sort of stitched this narrative together that hopefully leaves you wanting more as you're going throughout it, throughout the story. But in each in each segment, trying to unfold it in a way that is comprehensible to readers who have no knowledge of this subject or these subjects of UFOs and consciousness, coming to it cold and learning about it as I do. That's really the sense of it, and that's really what I'm trying to do with this story.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think it was extremely well done, and I never got the sense that it was an awkward medium for you. It seemed like you were adept at making those moments dramatic when they needed to be, and always fascinating. I mentioned Ingo Swann earlier, but that's it. What I'd like to do is like, you know, the ultimate conclusion that you come to, which I want to talk about at some point, is informed by the cast of characters that you encounter along the way of the journey. And there are several folks who are really, really formative to the conclusions that you ultimately draw. And I mentioned some of them in the beginning. There's, Donald Hoffman is huge, Ingo Swann, Philip K. Dick, Robert Bigelow, Edgar Mitchell, Jacques Vallee, Kit Green, Garry Nolan, M. Teoradani, who had some really interesting things to say about our projection of attributes on aspects of the phenomenon and how much we're plastering it with our own expectations, which I thought was really fascinating. So let's talk about what your conclusions were, and then maybe we can break out what each of these individual folks maybe helped you come to in terms of your ultimate prognosis. On the consciousness front, basically, I mean, you end up in an idealist kind of position where everything is sort of united and the universe functions as a sort of supra mind. And that we're kind of like filaments within that mind, and that, like Edgar Mitchell once says, it's also sort of a reincarnation engine, and that we're working through this system to learn. Is that a fair description? And what do you think over time led you to that conclusion? And we'll start there.
Okay, so we'll go into all of that. And I'm I'm always a little leery about about providing my endings, because
That's a
these
good
these
point. Yeah.
books are meant to be read kind of not as a thriller exactly. That's overstating it, but they're meant to be sort of unfolding.
Yeah.
But yeah, you have, James, you've presented kind of elements of the end. And I don't think I'm probably giving away too much when I say that, or at least I'm not, I don't think I'm spoiling the reading of the book by saying that in the end, what all the evidence points me to is simulation theory. That actually we live in a simulation. And I didn't even know when I started researching it, probably much less writing it, because I was researching it as I was writing it, or at least many aspects of it. Um, that what simulation theory really was, and to those who don't know it, and I'm going to really simplify this. It's a little bit like, so it's the idea is that we live out existence much as my kids are living out playing as a character in a game like The Sims, for example, wherein we live in a simulated world, of course, in which everything is super real because it is. We are immersed in a kind of holographic universe, and which presents itself to us as solidly real. But that just comes with the simulation, in my view. I didn't come to that decision lightly. It was informed by some of the characters, the scientists, whom I encounter and write about along the way, and you've mentioned some of them. So the first the first person who helped me inform that view was Ingo Swann, as you say. Uh, that's a little counterintuitive because I don't think, at least I haven't come across anywhere where Ingo says he felt that we live in a simulated reality or universe. But Ingo was a remarkable person who, as well as being a gifted psychic, read extensively on all aspects of consciousness, reality. He had a phenomenal library. When I visited his place in New York, which I did several times, I was blown away by just how extensive his knowledge was of all of this. And for him, that was a key part of trying to unravel the mystery of, who we are, what reality is, what consciousness is. And for Ingo, there were multiple layers to human consciousness, starting off at the sort of the ego level, and then there was a higher self level, and then there was a soul level, and all of that then plugged into what he called the matrix. The matrix being this swirling mass of energies and forces that we don't recognize for what they are. We have this interpretation of what they are, but for Ingo, these energies and forces were currents that could literally sweep us along in our lives. His view was that we needed to understand this unseen universe in order not to be sort of blown by the fates, as he would have said, because unless we took control of our own consciousness, as he said, we would find ourselves co-opted by others, other forces, some good, some not so good. And to avoid that happening, we needed to understand who we were at these depth levels of consciousness to take ownership of our own lives, literally our lives, because it wasn't just this life, it might be multiple lives preceding this life. So Inga was sort of a great, again, entry level for me to sort of get to grips with the idea that there is more to us than simply the solid exterior bodily shell.
Yeah.
The next person who helped me understand how we interface with reality was again someone you mentioned, Professor Donald Hoffman, a cognitive scientist from the University of California. And Hoffman's analogy of how we interpret reality was massively instructive to me because everything I'd read until that point was extremely hard for a non-scientist, as I am, to get your head around. But Hoffman presents it in very simple terms. In essence, he says all of those swirling energies and forces that Ingo Swann was talking about are encapsulated on a screen of perception that is much like the screen that I'm looking at you on now, my desktop on my computer. And on that desktop are icons, icons of experience, icons of life. We literally, Hoffman says, click on an infinite number of icons in order to interface with reality. And that is because life, our material life, filters out anything that we don't need for our survival and the continuation of our species. That is purely what this interface, according to Donald Hoffman, is all about. So, in those icons of life and experience, just as there are on my desktop, that is embedded with all kinds of code. In the case of the universe and reality, those embedded codes are, well, we don't know, but you can bet your bottom dollar they encapsulate electromagnetism and many other forces besides that that we need to, much of which we need to filter out in order to navigate this material reality.
Mhm.
So Hoffman, in giving us that model, we can understand our interface with reality and our perceptual abilities was hugely helpful for me in getting my head around the fact that what we see and perceive is quotes not real. And probably then the third one was the astronaut Edgar Mitchell. Edgar Mitchell had a profound experience on his way back from the moon. He was the sixth man to walk on the moon. On his way back from the moon, he had this epiphany in which he felt that he and every molecule, atom, and subatomic particle of the universe were one, that the universe was alive, it was speaking to him, he was part of it, it was part of him. And he explains that in very scientific terms, as you'd expect from an astronaut and engineer. So those three people, Ingo, Donald Hoffman, Edgar Mitchell, gave me a pretty solid perspective on something that turned out to be not solid, which is a consciousness-led, consciousness-driven universe. And that was massively helpful in getting me into this subject. And in the book, I try to unpick and unpack that in a way that is comprehensible to the reader, because I had to make what they were saying comprehensible to me. And as I said, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a physicist. When I was at Jane's Defense Weekly, I had to stop engineers who'd get carried away in explaining, radar systems or jet engines in ways that I wouldn't understand. And I'd have to stop them and go, I'm really sorry, but in order to make this comprehensible to my readers, you're going to have to make this comprehensible to me, which means that I'm going to ask you stupid questions about how this radar system works and how this jet engine works. And then once I've understood it, I can communicate it. And I kind of had to do the same thing with consciousness as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there we are.
That's the business of a journalist. I covered city councils for 20 years at the local newspaper, and converting bureaucraties into something that people can understand when you're talking about city budgets or county budgets is much the same exercise, though a little less heady.
Same thing. I mean, it is the same thing because you
Yeah.
would have written for a sort of in a specialized arena. I started off writing in a very specialized arena, aerospace and defense, and same thing. But I was writing, my readership was very broad, so I had to do exactly the same as you did, which was it wasn't to write for the lowest common denominator, but it was to write always for someone I felt who was coming to this subject, whatever that subject was, cold, which is what I've had to do here.
Yeah, you did an admirable job. A couple things I wanted to dive into on that. You call it simulation theory, which is interesting because it is. I mean, it conforms to that idea, but then it also resonates with a lot of mystical ideas that came before. And I wonder how much of that is just a choice of language, and if that was a conscious choice on your part.
Well, I'm not sure the language exists that describes or should describe the universe that I think I'm I'm articulating or trying
Mhm.
to articulate. Simulation theory is close, but it's not it. Because as you say, there is something of the creator and the mysticism and the spirituality imbuing the simulation, which is ineffable. And I don't want to take that mystery away from this because insofar as I do believe that what we're presented with is, quotes, not real and is, to all intents and purposes, simulation led or, information theory led, and there's some crossover between those two. But there is this other aspect to it, which is, as I said, it's this, the mysticism part. And again, at various points in the story, I'm confronted with explanations, evidence, and data from people who want to impart their knowledge to me uh, using, things that they've discovered along the way, which they felt would be instructive to me. One of those was Gnosticism, for example. The Gnostics were uh, people who felt when they came together, in the first century after Christ, that Christ's message was not the one that the church, the organized religion of the church, was imparting to its flock, but one that was much more direct and personal. I mean, actually, the Gnostic tradition is not a million miles away at all from the tradition of mystics the world over. And that bespeaks a relationship with reality and consciousness that is highly direct, highly personal, highly unfiltered through the sort of contact modalities of choice, whether that is a shamanic way in or whether it is a meditational way in. These days, you can probably access that same state through the ingestion of a psychedelic drug like DMT or maybe even LSD. Um, these are all sort of portals of access which bring that filter down, that Hoffman filter down, and introduce us to that highly unknown world that lies beyond this perception screen. So all of this was imparted to me sort of by stages, by my witnesses, by the people who I encounter on the journey. And it is a journey that's described in the book. And all of it was extremely instructive. But of course, for as many people as I put in the book, there are many I leave out because it is a bewildering array uh, um, of people and witnesses who have knowledge on this subject. And I wanted to kind of strip it down to a set of waypoints that were helpful for me. So my waypoints are not going to be the waypoints that other people would choose to tell this story, but they were the ones that worked for me.
Yeah. And like I said, it worked for me famously. But talking about the Donald Hoffman's icons, it's interesting because the name of your Substack is Rogue Icons, and that's sort of how you end up defining what UAPs and other anomalous eruptions into our reality are. It's sort of this, strange access to icons that are normally unavailable to us in our typical day-to-day experience, but in particular moments or for particular people, strange things manifest, and those are what you call rogue icons, which I think is a really interesting and powerful idea. one of the other things that you talk about in the book in relation to consciousness is the Orch-OR theory of Stuart Hameroff and um, uh,
Sir Roger Penrose.
Sir Roger Penrose. I should remember that name. But can you talk a little bit about how that impacted your view and why it's important to for later on you draw a lot of conclusions about how certain things may be mechanically happening in consciousness, and some of that is through the mechanisms provided by the Orch-OR theory.
Sure. So, Orch-OR theory, orchestrated
Reduction, right?
reduction. Thank you. Orchestrated reduction theory proposed by Sir Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. Both, I mean, Sir Roger Penrose is a Nobel laureate. Stuart Hameroff is a very credentialed anesthesiologist. So they know what they're talking about, these people. And whilst, as I said earlier, no one knows what how consciousness works, they've come up with a very interesting theory which says that we have microtubules, tiny little structures within the neurons of our brain. In fact, they exist in cells across our body, but let's focus on the brain for the moment. And within those microtubules, these tiny little filamented structures, quantum processes collapse within them at a rate of about, I think, anyway, multiple times per second to give us a sort of sequential interpretation of reality. And through the sort of, the stringing together of these collapses of quantum waveforms in these microscopic structures, we build up a picture of what reality is, and this is how we navigate the world. The interesting thing, of course, and the controversial thing, there are many controversial things about it, but probably the most controversial thing is that classical quantum physicists say that you can't have quantum effects outside of the cold, static conditions that are required for quantum processes to occur. Penrose and Hameroff differ with that. They say that the warm, mushy conditions of the brain and those microtubular structures do allow for quantum processes to take place. And in effect, what they're doing is allowing for an exchange of information between us as human beings, as individuated units of consciousness, and the world of information that exists outside us, that matrix-like world that Ingo Swann talked about, Donald Hoffman talked about, and also Edgar Mitchell as existing out there. But it's not an out there, actually. Somehow what we do through this screen of perception is turn ourselves into an avatar that wanders through this holographic universe, seeing the world the way we do. So between them, these three guys that I mentioned beforehand, Hoffman, Swann, and Edgar Mitchell, and then the Orch-OR theory of Penrose and Hameroff, they allow us, amongst many people, or they certainly allowed me, to formulate an idea, a sense of how we as material beings in this life are able to navigate this swirling mass of energies and forces that make up the matrix-like universe which we occupy.
Yeah, I love your book, and just hearing you talk about it is fantastic. I'm diving pretty deep in your material. I hope that doesn't bother you. I mean, I want to. Okay, cool, because I don't want to give away all your secrets, but I know my readers, and this will not discourage people from picking up your book. On that note, though, um, sort of an aside, but are you going to publish it as a standalone volume at some point?
I hope to. I certainly hope to. I mean, I have
Yeah,
all my other books I have.
yeah,
Um, right now, that's not happening, but I
yeah,
hope to one day for sure.
yeah. Because I would buy that volume. So yeah. Um, a little bit about, I mean, sort of going through this list of names and the ideas that kind of propelled your ultimate, conclusions in this. Jacques Vallee and Philip K. Dick sort of kind of merge into. I mean, you deal a lot with Vallee's control system thesis about, what we're seeing in terms of the UFO phenomenon is reality sort of reacting to us, seeming to want to shape us. You talk about um, the theory that he posited that the reinforcement schedule that is accomplished through liminal contact with UFOs and whatnot can shape belief over long periods of time, and that maybe the whole point of like a UFO thing is for that to occur. And then you also talk about Philip K. Dick and his novel Valis, and is also his own visionary experiences. Real quick, he answered the door one day, and there was a woman at the door who had a Jesus fish necklace on, and it was like this cosmic moment where he felt like he was suddenly in contact with this vast and active living intelligence system, which is Valis, and he went on to write Exegesis, which is a fascinating, if slightly cryptic, read. But can you talk a little bit about how those two things helped shape your thinking in terms of the UFO phenomenon part of your subject? Yeah.
Sure. I've long admired Jacques Vallée's work. I read him first quite a few years ago, and actually, I'll confess to begin with, I didn't really understand where he was coming from. Um, this idea that the UFO phenomenon might not be the nuts and bolts phenomenon that most people associate it with. In other words, you know, most of us, I think, come to the idea of the UFO phenomenon that this is something extraterrestrial, that beings, if they come here at all, are coming here in interplanetary vehicles from God knows where in the galaxy or the universe or wherever. Um, Vallee introduces us to this idea that that may not be so at all, that this might be an iteration of a phenomenon that's actually been with us for a very long time. And he associated it with sort of the mythical lore of fairies and jinn and, crypto creatures and, all sorts of kind of weird stuff from folklore from centuries past that has just simply been updated in our perception as the UFO phenomenon. I found that really hard to get my head around when I first started to read it a few decades back. Um, but the more I read Vallee, the more I could see that this was a really intriguing theory and one that was so in advance of its time when he first wrote about it, which I think he did in the 70s and 80s. So I felt really lucky when I first met Jacques, and I met Jacques at the fifth Philip K. Dick Film Festival in 2017 in New York City. And so I had a chat with Jacques then, and then Jacques goes on stage along with a few other luminaries from this field, like Dr. Hal Puthoff. Um, Jacques was on stage, and also a remote viewer called Colonel Tom McNear, one of Ingo's students, was also on stage at this fifth Philip K. Dick Film Festival, which was in that iteration in 2017 was dedicated to talking about Ingo Swann and his life, which is why I was there. And Jacques starts to talk on stage about this book called Valis by Philip K. Dick, which I've not heard of. I mean, I wasn't a Philip K. Dick aficionado at the time. I was aware of some of the stories he'd written, like, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which got turned into Blade Runner, and a few other of his stories. But Valis I'd not heard of. So I picked myself up a copy sometime later and I read it, and God, it was the most impenetrable sort of 200 odd pages, I think I've ever read. But there was something in it as well, which I really wanted to sort of persist with. So I read it once and then I read it again, which actually was something that Jacques Vallee said that you needed to do, like keep rereading this thing. And it in amongst its sort of somewhat rambling narrative, there are these sort of truths about simulation theory, and there are truths about sort of Gnosticism that shine through it and begin to sort of bespeak how we might perceive reality around us. I owe Jacques a debt of gratitude for introducing me to Varlis. Varlis introduced me to ideas like simulation theory and Gnosticism, all of which sort of strip away our conventional views of what reality is. Um, and then, of course, from there, I was able to revisit Jacques Vallée's control system theory, which you mentioned, James, which basically says that there are forces which control us and control us psychically. We're not generally aware of this because their influence is very subtle. But one of the ways that whoever they are, do this is through the UFO phenomenon. And that is not, immediately clear and obvious, even though, Jacques is a good explainer of these things. But, in essence, he is saying that the appearance of things in the sky that are arcane and mysterious have this effect of awakening our consciousness in a way that gets us to question the reality around us. I mean, in essence, I'm paraphrasing it and slightly butchering it, but that's the essence of it. And the phenomenon, therefore, acts, as Jacques says, much like a thermostat does in a home. It raises and lowers our consciousness, much as a thermostat would the heat in a house, to keep us where it wants us to be, in terms of how we perceive reality, which is a bit of an alarming idea to most of us. The idea that the bodily journey that we have in life may not be us being in control of our lives as much as we think and would like. But it's a very, it's not an easy thing to get our heads around. And so I do spend time in the book, as you say, trying to unpick Vallée's control system theory. And I counterbalance it with simulation theory. I'm going, okay, so who's in control? Is it aliens? Let's call them aliens, or non-human intelligence entities. Are they doing the controlling, or is the controller doing the controlling? And who or what is the controller? Is the controller the creator, a creator? Is it a false creator, which is what Gnosticism tells us it might be? The demiurge, yeah. Or is it just code? Is there simulation code in the system which is controlling us somehow? So I try to get to grips with all of this in a way that is comprehensible. And that's a challenge, but
Yeah.
I like to think that I've given it a good shot.
There's so much that I love about this book. One of the things that you kind of play around with is the idea of spin being kind of a binary, function of reality that may be a way that memory is stored within the very fabric of reality. And that sort of plays along with these ideas. You go down, you mentioned so many like insights into how all this potentially works. That's what I meant by in the beginning, that it's really like this coalescence of all these ideas that have been out in the ether and that I've talked about on my show repeatedly. One of the things that you bring up that I have been fascinated with, I read Robert Temple's A New Science of Heaven, and he talks about plasma and how plasma can form, especially when it's a complex dusty plasma, can form structures. And these structures, some say, can take on function and form, and they form double helixes and walls and conduits and veins of sorts, and that he posits that it's very possible, if not likely, that they may be able to form some kind of proto-intelligence, which people who observe plasmas often observe. They can be attracted to each other, they can avoid one another, they can seemingly investigate phenomena that they encounter. Um, so can you talk a little bit about the role that you think plasma might play in some of this discussion? And you also make the interesting point, and I was unaware of this, but that plasma at times can appear metallic, which so if we see something flying in the sky that looks like it's a sphere, a metal sphere, it may be a characteristic of the plasma that we're observing rather than actually being a metallic solid, I guess.
Yeah. Uh, so plasma and its uh, role in the story, as I tell it, was one of the great joys for me in researching this story because I when I set out to tell this story, I was dimly aware of plasma. I mean, I'd come across plasma in my work as an aerospace and defense journalist. Um, there is a thing called plasma stealth, for example. The Russians, who I reported on quite extensively, both before and after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union imploded or was dissolved. The Russians did a lot of work in plasma stealth, coating, trying to coat their very unstealthy aeroplanes in plasma to um, to shield it from radar detection and spoof radar detection as well. And plasma has that role, by the way, in aerospace and defense. It can both um, decoy radars from an aircraft, but it can also shield aircraft from radar as well. So there's plenty of utility in the defense world for plasmas. Um, but what I was unaware of was just how influential plasma is in the universe. 99% of the universe is composed of plasma. I didn't know that when I went into writing this book. Um, and I think there's a good reason for that, actually, because there is a cosmology to the universe that we inhabit, which has been told by Big Bang theorists. And Big Bang Theory is the official cosmology, the origin story of our universe. And plasma theory, which goes into a tells the story of an electric universe, is not convenient to Big Bang theorists. So the plasma story has been very much relegated by Big Bang theorists. But even so, in the last, I'd say 3 decades, maybe a bit more, plasma, the sort of the plasma story of the universe has been allowed to come through. And now we know that 99% of the universe, as I said, is composed of plasma. Plasma is the fourth state of matter. It is the stuff of lightning. It is the stuff of the aurora borealis. It is the stuff of my plasma screen TV, and the neon, the gas in a neon light tube. So plasma is everywhere. literally, I mean, in our material world and outside there in the universe, but it is sort of not obvious that it is. So it enters the story for me because, as we know in the UAP UFO space, there is plenty of talk about plasmoids, which are orb-like plasmas, which make their appearance increasingly so, it seems. And not unnaturally, as I'm looking at the UFO phenomenon, I've become interested in these plasmoids, and I want to know what they are, of course. And it strikes me that they are integral to UFO sightings going back a long way. I talk about the Foo Fighters in World
Mhm.
War II, and these plasmoids during World War II attach themselves to Allied bomber formations predominantly over Germany, predominantly in the latter phases of the war. But they also make their appearances post-war in post-war America. So in New Mexico, they appear in sort of 1946, 47. And they have, of course, throughout the decades since. And now, I mean, it's like you can't click into X or YouTube without seeing videos of these plasmoids in the sky. Um, I have a particular theory about these plasmoids, which they are interfaces between the deeper realities, the reality that we've been talking about, um, this perceptual screen that limits us from seeing beyond our material world predominantly. I think plasmas are interface media that are useful both to non-human intelligence and possibly to our own militaries as uh, uh, these interface mediums. So I suggest that non-human intelligence may use plasma as this transitioning medium that is perhaps instrumental in converting whatever exists for them, non-human intelligence, interdimensionally into our dimension. Um, Plasma may have that role of allowing whatever it is, however they exist beyond this dimension to enter our own dimension through the medium of the plasma. Um, what I'm also fascinated by, as you'll know from the book, is the mimicking capacity of plasma.
Yeah.
This was very counterintuitive to me to begin with. Um, it uh, 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 it was screaming at me, this should not be so. I wanted to believe that what I was seeing, what I am seeing through these testimonies of, witnesses to the UFO phenomenon for decades was something materially, solidly real. Jacques Vallee, going back to him for a second, um, is was enigmatic to me when he described the UFO phenomenon as being both physical and psychic. And I really wondered about that. I didn't understand what he meant. How could a phenomenon both be real and unreal? But I think through the plasma medium, we're able to begin to understand that, in that plasma being the fourth state of matter is, in a sense, neither real nor unreal. It is both physical and non-physical. But it has this capacity, I think, to be shaped and manipulated. And to an extent also to act as a mirror to us. So when people who indulge in, I think it's called Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, CE5 encounters, more recently given the name psionics, wherein operators or experiencers summon UFOs to them. They often appear first in this plasmoid form, but very rapidly they take on another form. They morph into something. And I think that that is as I say in the book, it is a product of multiple influences. But one of them we should not dismiss is us, in that our consciousness, quotes, is providing this sort of mirroring aspect to the phenomenon, in that it will appear to us in different different guises. It may even be responsible for that migration that Vallee talked about, going back over hundreds of years. What used to appear in the form of fairies and jinn and mythical creatures has sort of morphed over the years into this phenomenon that we in a technological age are able to get our heads around, which is the UFO phenomenon. But even within that, these plasmas have this mimicking capacity, wherein they are able to take on forms that we recognize, like drones, like aircraft. But there's always something a little bit
A
off
bit
about
wrong.
them,
Yeah.
which suggests to me that the medium, the transitional capacity of the medium, is imperfect. It doesn't quite get it right. Navigation lights on these aircraft or on these drones are a little bit off. They don't behave like drones should. Drones, if they're in surveillance mode, should be stealthy. What are they shining lights onto the ground for? Why are they behaving in ways like it's almost drawing attention to themselves? This is not how the operators of Russian or Chinese surveillance drones should be operating, but yet they do. So you're right, James. There's lots more to unpick about plasma, but plasma is a fascinating, and for me, it was a fascinating thread that runs throughout this book.
A couple of things. My wife and I were having a discussion a while back when the drone thing was happening, right? And uh, in New Jersey primarily, but also other places. And there were a lot of reports of, the drones morphing or kind of looking like weird, bastardized forms of aircraft that don't quite match what an aircraft is supposed to look like. And my wife had mentioned, Amy, that it's almost like those initial AI renderings of art. Like, you'd see online for a while, the AI would post some scene that it had generated from nothing, and it would be like a form eating spaghetti, but like the fork is going into the neck, and there's a lot of weird things about the image that don't comport with reality or how things really are. But this was AI's best guess of what the image was, and so it was an imperfect rendering by a mechanical process, basically. Which
And to that point,
yeah,
I mean, if we live in a simulation-based universe or an information-based universe, um, it doesn't take much imagination to see how that information, the information substrate that underpins the simulation, can be bent and corrupted in some way, and that it's going to be imperfect, just like our own AI algorithms get, they hallucinate to
mhm,
provide the things that you and Amy are talking about. Um, so it could very easily be, I suggest, with simulation theory, that there are there are ways and means of, these things get bent out of shape. And sometimes that is accidental and sometimes it's deliberate. Um, you know, that is quite a scary prospect, that there are probably mechanisms for doing that, terrestrial mechanisms for bending reality out of shape.
yeah,
And but if we're beginning to toy with it, you can bet your bottom dollar that non-human intelligence is and has probably mastered it with that just that tiny little bit of imperfection that we see over places like New Jersey, where those drones were just always a little bit off. And I'm again, that's my background. My background is aerospace and defense,
Hmm.
and I'm trying to rationalize that. I'm trying to rationalize why drones that are surveilling, particularly air bases like, I mean, we had before New Jersey, there were, Langley, Virginia,
Yeah.
the air base there was beset with, a drone plague. I think at the end of 2023, early 24. And, what I'm trying to rationalize is why organizations that I've reported on, deferred to for a professional opinion, professes publicly to be as baffled as everyone else by what is happening to it.
Hmm.
So, drone swarms over Langley Air Force Base, Virginia. You'd think that the US Air Force would know what was above that base, but it is more than happy, as it was in New Jersey, to say, we don't know what's going on over the skies, in the skies of New Jersey. We don't know what's going on in the skies over one of our premier Air Force bases very close to Washington, D.C. Um, it takes something, I know, having reported on these bodies professionally, for them to say that.
Hmm.
But it also makes me wonder um, what they're hiding,
Exactly
because
right. Yeah.
because you know the organizations like the Air Force, the US Air Force, our own Air Force, they hate to look stupid. They hate to look uninformed. And yet here they are saying, A, we don't know what this is. And B, they're saying, but there's nothing to fear here, folks. There's nothing to be afraid of. I think I make the point in the book. Those two statements do not square with one another.
Yeah.
You cannot not know what is in the sky and in the next breath say, and you don't need to be alarmed by this stuff.
Yeah.
Because the simple truth and the corollary from a logic perspective is you don't know unless you
Exactly.
know, unless you know more than you're letting on, which is a
Yeah.
distinct possibility.
Yeah. And I mean, it's if you weigh it, it's like what's worse, admitting ignorance or admitting knowledge that is somehow going to alarm the public? And it seems like that I don't believe they don't know, or at least I don't believe that's the entire answer. So there's something about them that if we knew might be more alarming than the fact that there are drones hovering over our assets. It's something about it is deeply mysterious and troubling, or they would be more forthcoming. Um, so, I mean, yeah,
I rest my case.
yeah, exactly right. Um, One thing that you mentioned that really intrigued me over the course of the book was M. Teoradani, or Teoradani, if I'm saying that right. I'd never heard of him before, a Hungarian scientist, and you were talking a little bit about that mimicry thing, where people have that somehow our consciousness is shaping what we're seeing in anomalous phenomenon. And it reminds me of some work I've read with Joshua Cutchin and even Jeffrey Kripal, talking about how some of these anomalous events that people encounter in our life are manifestations of our own stories and imagination, and that it may be mimicking what our, creative energies are producing within us, implying some sort of connection to consciousness. Have I got that right? What do you find fascinating about Tia Radani's work? Uh,
Okay, well, just to correct you there a little
okay,
bit,
thank you.
there were two people there
Okay.
in that piece that you just talked about. So Massimo Teodarani is an Italian physicist who's into the whole plasma orb
Oh,
thing,
okay.
and
Okay.
he has spent time investigating the plasma lights that are the Earth lights that are seen at Hessdalen in Norway.
Oh, okay. I got it
So,
confused. I'm sorry about
and
that.
those are fascinating in their own right. And he's a physicist. He's an astrophysicist. He's done some extraordinary work. He believes they could be intelligent. And you talked earlier about Sir Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff saying that these orb plasmas, these dusty plasmas, um, appear to exhibit a kind of crude form of intelligence and are reactive, in much the same way as particles, and may connect in the same way that quantum particles connect when they're entangled. So it's almost like these plasmoids are scaled up um, microscopic particles, or they behave like them in a sort of quantum entangled way. That's so point one. That's Massimo Teoradani and the
Yeah.
plasmoids. Then there is a guy called Professor, I think, Eddie Frexka.
Yeah, Friska.
I,
Yes,
I
that's what
may
it
have
is.
butchered his name, and I'm sorry if I have, Eddie, if you're listening to me, but he is Hungarian,
Yeah.
and he has proposed that there is this sort of projecting aspect of us, of our consciousness, that may project out into reality. And if we can divert to Donald Hoffman's perception screen for a moment, that we literally project our hopes, fears, dreams, etc., onto this perceptual screen, and that they mirror us to some degree. So, it's the old New Age adage of be careful what you wish for, because you will get what you wish for. And
Yeah.
intention, actually, we know just from a quantum mechanical perspective, is a powerful thing. The observer effect is powerful, but intention can influence our environment as well. So all of this kind of really combines to say that we as humans, and I'm aping Ingo Swann here, because Ingo's mantra was um, human potential is just extraordinary and unlimited, and it's been boxed in to this, you know, material meat box of ours in a way that is just waiting to be unleashed. And many of the things that we've talked about, in terms of projecting ourselves, our hopes, fears, dreams, but also, just our psychic potential. I mean, I've seen enough, even in my limited experience, to know that, psychic phenomena exists. Psychic projection exists. Ingo was able to perturb machinery psychically just with his mind. Um, the controversial Uri Geller has, to my mind, clearly demonstrated psychic potential. I've been in the same room as Uri several times and watched him spoon bend. He's done that to my satisfaction several times. Not only me, but he's done that to the satisfaction of the CIA many times as well. And so, there is more to heaven and earth than we usually dare to dream. But it's out there, and I just hope that science, which is beginning to shed its sort of straitjacketed views on the true nature of existence, just catches up with the rest of us, which seems to know that there is much more to the universe than mainstream science would have us believe. And that's a sad thing, because to my mind, inquiry is driven by curiosity, and science is meant to be inquisitive and curious, but so often it is suppressing in the way that it treats, subject matters like this, even though I know just from basic reading of Thomas Kuhn, who um, mentioned earlier, James, who came up, of course, with the whole idea of paradigms and paradigm shifts and paradigms of science. I know from his work that it's the anomaly that usually is the outlier that bespeaks the sort of it is the harbinger of a paradigm shift. So I don't know why science is so down on this stuff, because if it wasn't, I think it would get to grips with the true nature of existence a lot more than it's struggling to do at the moment, frankly.
That is a wonderful place to end it. I would add one quote from your book where you said, "We all need to wake the fuck up," which
Yeah.
I think makes that
Um,
point wonderfully.
well, it's prosaic and perhaps a little Anglo-Saxon for some people's tastes, but I do mean it. I mean, uh, and I'm not. I don't mean I'm not lecturing. I'm just. I just. I've had this amazing journey on this book. I mean, I start out a nuts and bolts guy. I'm an investigative reporter. I report on a subject, a field that couldn't be more material. Aerospace and defense. But through listening to people who I know have experiences to tell, data to impart, and stories to tell as well, and to keep an open mind and not dismiss some of the weirder accounts that otherwise would turn me off, but just to hold that open mind, listen to what they're saying, and then go through that journey as I did, and arrive where I have, which you very politely haven't revealed. So maybe some people will want to find out where the book ends up as well.
It has
That's
the answers. I mean, you're positing theories, but there are some profound existential answers in what you've come to, which I think is wonderful. It's like, but you're like you said, you're not lecturing, you're not hitting people over the head with it, but you're like, this is the possibilities that we can uh, fruitfully entertain because you're not doing it through out of your own head. Like you talk to all these really intelligent people who are all invested in their expertise and have done a lot of deep thinking on these topics. And you come to places that are encouraging and important for the moment that we're living in, I think. The meta crisis and all that.
Well, thank you. That's all I tried to do, and I had a lot of fun doing it. So, and I've had a lot of fun talking on the show today. So, thanks for having me
Yeah.
on.
Yeah, no, thank you, man. I appreciate it.